Sometimes the hardest thing to see is how cruel a person can become to himself when fear gets hold of the wheel. It is deeply exhausting to live under that kind of pressure, always bracing for judgment, always believing everyone else has the truth while you are stuck carrying the shame. In these stories, the pain does not always come from some loud enemy standing in the room. A lot of it comes from the quiet lies that build up inside, the ones that say you are behind, broken, unwanted, or one mistake away from losing everything. And later on, one writer reaches a point where the silence in his life feels louder than any voice around him, which tells you just how heavy this hidden struggle can become. But that is not where these stories stay. Little by little, the false stories start to crack, the pressure starts to loosen, and peace begins to enter where fear used to rule. There is real accountability here, real honesty, and the kind of boundaries that finally protect a person from his own worst patterns. So settle in, take a breath, and let us step into the very first story together. The night I realized everyone was lying to me, including myself. I was sitting on my bed at like 10:30 at night, phone 6 inches from my face, thumb moving like it had a life of its own, when it hit me that I felt physically sick from looking at other people's lives and I still could not stop. Every swipe was another punch. Tyler Grayson flexing in perfect lighting with abs that looked carved, caption about discipline. Jenna Morales smiling in some rooftop bar downtown, her teeth white enough to glow, comments full of people calling her unstoppable. Marcus Liu posting his new car like it was nothing, keys dangling, hard work pays off. Meanwhile, I was in my room in Johannesburg, blinds half closed, hoodie on even though it was not cold, trying not to think about how behind I felt in every possible way. It got so bad that I started timing my own life against theirs. Like if I was not at their level by a certain age, then I was done for. Like some invisible clock was ticking just for me, and everyone else had already figured out the cheat code. The worst part is none of them even knew I existed in their orbit like that, but in my head they were judges and I was constantly failing. I would open the app telling myself I would just check one thing, then 2 hours later it would be past midnight, and I would be deep in some spiral comparing my worst moments to their best angles, feeling like I was the only one who had not cracked the formula. I remember one specific post from Sarah Klein, someone I went to school with, where she was laughing with friends on a beach, sunset behind them, everything golden, and I stared at that picture so long my eyes started to hurt, because I kept trying to figure out what she had that I did not, like there was some hidden ingredient in her life that made it worth living. That is when the thoughts got ugly. I started thinking maybe I was just fundamentally less, like something in me was wired wrong, like everyone else got confidence, and I got this constant buzzing anxiety that made even simple conversations feel like exams I was going to fail. It spilled into real life too. When my friend Daniel invited me out, I would make excuses because I assumed I would be the awkward one. When my coworker Lindu tried to joke with me, I would overanalyze everything I said afterward, convinced I sounded stupid. Even when I was alone, I could not relax. I would end up gooning to distract myself from the feeling, then hate myself more afterward, which just fed the cycle. Around 1:15 in the morning, my phone battery dipped to like 5%, and instead of plugging it in, I just let it die in my hand because I was too drained to even move. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost aggressive, like all the noise I had been drowning in just cut out at once. I remember staring at the black screen and seeing my own reflection faintly, and it looked nothing like the person I had built up in my head as a failure. It was just me tired, yeah, but not broken, not some lost cause. That should have been obvious, but it was not until that exact moment. What actually flipped the switch was something small and kind of stupid. Earlier that day, I had run into Marcus Liu at a grocery store, the same guy with the car post, and he looked nothing like the version of himself online. He was stressed, talking on the phone, saying something about debt and how he might have made a mistake. At the time I brushed it off, like maybe it was a one-off thing, but sitting there in the dark, it came back clear as day. Then I remembered Tyler Grayson complaining in the locker room months ago about how he felt like he was never big enough, even with those same abs he posts. Then Sarah Klein, who I knew had gone through a breakup she never mentioned online. One by one, the images started cracking. It was like I had been staring at a mirror that was warped, and I finally stepped back enough to see the distortion. I realized I was not comparing my real life to their real lives. I was comparing my behind the scenes to their highlights, then filling in all the gaps with my own worst assumptions. I was the one completing the illusion. No one told me that Jenna Morales never felt insecure. I decided that. No one told me Tyler had everything figured out. I decided that too. The anxiety, the constant fear of judgment, the feeling that everyone was ahead of me, it was not coming from them. It was coming from the story I kept telling myself about them. That realization hit harder than anything else because it meant I could not just blame social media or other people. I had to admit I was participating in my own misery, but at the same time, it was the first thing that actually felt like a way out. If I was the one constructing this whole mental ranking system, then maybe I could stop. The next morning at around 9 o'clock, I woke up and did something I had never done before. I opened the app and instead of scrolling, I actually looked at it like it was a product designed to hook me, which it is. Perfect lighting, selective moments, captions crafted to signal success. It stopped feeling like reality and started feeling like marketing. That did not magically fix everything, but it loosened the grip. When I saw a post that would normally make my chest tighten, I caught the thought forming and actually questioned it. Like when Daniel posted about a party I was not at, my first instinct was to think I was excluded because I was not fun enough. Then I paused and remembered he literally invited me and I said no. That was on me, not some secret judgment. So instead of spiraling, I texted him. We ended up meeting later that week and it was normal, not some test I had to pass. Same with Lindu. I stopped replaying every conversation in my head and just let things be a little messy. Nothing catastrophic happened. People did not suddenly decide I was a joke. If anything, things got easier because I was not constantly filtering myself through this imaginary audience. It took time, and I still catch myself slipping sometimes, especially late at night when the old habits try to creep back in, but the difference is I see it now. I see how quickly my brain tries to turn someone else's moment into evidence that I am failing. And once you see that pattern, it loses a lot of its power. The craziest part is nothing about my external life dramatically changed. I did not suddenly get richer, more attractive, or more successful overnight. What changed was the way I was interpreting everything. That constant pressure I thought was coming from the outside was mostly self-generated. Realizing that did not make me perfect, but it made me a lot less trapped. And honestly, that was enough to finally breathe again. That first story ended in a strong and honest place because the writer finally saw that people like Marcus Liu, Tyler Grayson, Sarah Klein, and Jenna Morales were never the real judges in his life. The cruel pressure came from the false story he kept feeding in his own mind, and once he faced that truth, the whole illusion began to crack. That matters because a lie loses power the moment it gets named clearly. But sometimes that same fear does not show up as comparison. Sometimes it puts on cleaner clothes and calls itself perfection. It tells a person that if every detail is controlled, then no one will ever see the hurt underneath. That kind of pressure is incredibly unkind too, and it leaves a person just as trapped. So let us carry that lesson with us now and step into the next story together. I thought being perfect would save me. It almost destroyed me. I was standing in the bathroom at exactly 6:45 in the morning, staring at my reflection like it owed me something, when I felt that familiar panic claw up my chest because one side of my hair wouldn't sit flat, and my brain immediately told me today was already ruined. My name's Daniel, and back then I genuinely believed that if I could just get everything right, every detail locked in, nobody would ever see what I was really like underneath. The problem was I had no idea what that real version even was, just this vague, horrible certainty that it wasn't good enough. So I chased perfection like it was oxygen. I ironed my shirts twice, rewrote assignments until my hand cramped, rehearsed conversations in my head until they sounded robotic, and if anything slipped even a little, I spiraled. My friend Marcus used to joke that I treated life like a test I could fail at any moment, but he stopped laughing when he realized I wasn't joking. By the time I got to school that day, my chest was tight, my jaw ached from clenching, and I was already exhausted from trying to be flawless for a day that hadn't even started. First period was English with Mrs. Patel, and she handed back our essays. Mine had a 98 at the top, which should have felt like a win, but all I could see was the missing 2 points. She de-circled one sentence and written awkward phrasing. That was it, one sentence. And somehow that tiny mark felt like proof that I was slipping, that people were going to notice, that I was about to be exposed as not enough. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "Jude 98, chill." I forced a smile, but inside I was already rewriting the entire essay in my head, already planning how I'd fix it, already telling myself I couldn't let that happen again. It didn't stop at schoolwork either. I avoided parties because I couldn't control how I'd come across. I barely spoke to girls because I couldn't guarantee I'd say the right thing. Even when I was alone, I wasn't really alone. I'd sit in my room late at night, sometimes 11:30, sometimes closer to 1 in the morning, scrolling, comparing, sometimes even gooning just to shut my brain up for a bit. but the moment it was over, the noise came back louder, telling me I'd wasted time, that I was falling behind, that I needed to be better. My parents noticed something was off, especially my mom, Elena. She'd knock on my door and ask if I was okay, and I'd always say I was just tired from studying. That was the easiest lie because it wasn't entirely false. I was tired, just not from what they thought. The breaking point came during a group presentation in history class. There were 4 of us, me, Marcus, a girl named Jenna, and a guy named Lewis. We'd practiced, we knew our parts, but right before we went up, Jenna stumbled over one of her lines while rehearsing quietly and laughed it off. That tiny imperfection hit me like a punch. My brain immediately decided the whole presentation was going to fall apart, that we were going to look stupid, that I was going to be associated with failure. So I did something I still cringe thinking about. I snapped at her. I told her we couldn't afford mistakes, that she needed to take it seriously, that this wasn't a joke. The room went quiet. Jenna's face fell, Marcus stared at me like I'd lost it, and Lewis just shook his head. We still did the presentation and it went fine, actually better than fine, but it didn't matter because afterward Marcus pulled me aside and said, "What was that? You don't get to talk to people like that just because you're scared." I tried to defend myself, said I just wanted us to do well, but even as I spoke I knew that wasn't the full truth. The truth was uglier. I wasn't trying to protect the group. I was trying to protect myself from the possibility of being seen as imperfect. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything, the look on Jenna's face, Marcus's disappointment, the way my own voice had sounded, sharp and desperate. Around 2 a.m. I got up, went to the kitchen and just stood there in the dark. No music, no phone, nothing to distract me. For the first time, instead of trying to fix it, I just asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What exactly am I so afraid of people seeing? I expected some clear answer, some specific flaw, but nothing came. There was no concrete thing, no single trait I could point to, just this heavy, shapeless feeling of not being enough. And that's when it hit me, not all at once, but like something slowly clicking into place. Nobody had actually told me I wasn't enough. Not Marcus, not Jenna, not my parents, not my teachers. Every time I felt judged, it was me doing the judging. I was the one setting impossible standards, the one deciding that anything less than perfect was failure, the one assuming everyone else saw me the same harsh way I saw myself. It wasn't that I was hiding some horrible truth from the world. It was that I refused to accept any version of myself that wasn't flawless. The fear wasn't external. It was self-generated, constantly reinforced by the rules I'd made up. That realization didn't magically fix everything, but it changed the direction of the fight. The next day at school, I found Jenna before class. My heart was pounding, and every instinct told me to phrase the apology perfectly, to make it sound right, but I forced myself to just say it simply. I told her I was out of line, that I'd been stressed, but that wasn't an excuse, and that I was sorry. She looked at me for a second, then shrugged and said, "Yeah, you were kind of a jerk, but it's fine." And that was it. No big confrontation, no lasting judgment, just a normal human response. That moment stuck with me more than any grade ever had. Marcus came up later and bumped my shoulder, saying, "There you go, man." It wasn't some grand redemption, but it was real. Over the next few weeks, I started experimenting with being imperfect on purpose. I'd leave a minor mistake in an assignment instead of obsessing over it. I'd speak up in class without rehearsing every word. I even went to a small hangout at Lewis's place one evening, around 7, where people were passing around Tsar and laughing about dumb stuff, and for once I didn't feel like I had to perform. It was uncomfortable at first, like I was breaking some rule that would get me punished, but nothing catastrophic happened. People didn't suddenly reject me. If anything, they seemed more relaxed around me. The anxiety didn't disappear overnight. There were still mornings where I stared at the mirror too long, still nights where my brain tried to drag me back into that old loop. But now I could see it for what it was. Not a warning about how others saw me, but a reflection of how I was treating myself. And once I understood that, the whole system started to lose its grip. I didn't need to be perfect to hide anything, because there was nothing there that needed hiding in the first place. The flawed version of me I'd been terrified of was just a normal person, one who made mistakes, said the wrong thing sometimes, got messy, got tired, and kept going anyway. The real damage hadn't come from being imperfect. It came from believing I wasn't allowed to be. And letting go of that belief, even a little, felt like finally being able to breathe after holding it in for years. Daniel's ending carries a lot of weight because he finally stopped treating Jenna's mistake like a threat and started seeing how his own fear was pushing him to be harsh. Marcus was right to call him out, and Daniel was brave to apologize without hiding behind a polished excuse. That is how real change begins, not with perfection, but with honesty and a simpler kind of courage. And once a person starts loosening that grip, another fear often rises right behind it, the fear of being watched, measured, and silently judged just for being seen. That next kind of pain is quieter, but it can drain a person all the same. So let us take that understanding and move into the next story together. The day I realized nobody was looking at me the way I thought they were. I was halfway up the stairs to Ethan's apartment when I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and almost turned around for the third time that night because all I could see was everything wrong with my face and body at once. My shoulders looked uneven, my jaw too soft, my skin somehow both oily and dry, and I felt that familiar spike of heat in my chest like I was about to be exposed for something I couldn't even name. Ethan had texted me at 7 saying everyone was already there, including Sarah, and I had spent the last hour outside pacing like an idiot, pretending to scroll my phone, so I would not have to walk into a room where I was convinced every single person would silently clock how off I looked. It sounds dramatic when I say it out loud, but that is exactly how it felt, like stepping into a spotlight where the only thing on display was every flaw I had memorized over years of staring at myself too long. I finally forced myself up the last few steps and knocked, already planning how I would keep my head down, avoid photos, and leave early without making it obvious. Ethan opened the door with his usual grin, grabbed my shoulder, and pulled me in like nothing about me was worth a second glance, which somehow made it worse because I assumed he was just being nice. Inside, music was playing, people were laughing, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears as I scanned the room for any sign that someone had noticed something wrong with me. Sarah waved from the couch. Marcus was arguing with Jason about something dumb, and nobody paused, nobody stared, nobody whispered. But my brain kept insisting they were just subtle about it, that they saw everything I saw and were being polite enough not to say it. I stayed near the wall for a while, nursing a drink I barely touched, keeping my posture stiff so I would not accidentally reveal some angle of myself I hated more than the rest. At one point, Olivia asked if we could all take a group photo, and I felt this immediate drop in my stomach like I had just been told to step on stage naked. I tried to slip out of frame, but Ethan noticed and pulled me back in, laughing, saying, "Come on, man, stop hiding." I forced a smile, already thinking about how I would avoid looking at the picture later, how I would mentally prepare for confirmation that I looked exactly as bad as I feared. The flash went off, and I felt this weird mix of dread and resignation, like I had just agreed to document my worst self permanently. I spent the next hour barely engaging, nodding at conversations, laughing at the right times, but constantly monitoring how I looked, how I stood, where I placed my hands, whether my face was doing something strange without me realizing. It was exhausting in a way that made my chest tight and my head buzz. At some point, Sarah sat down next to me and asked if I was okay, and I immediately assumed she had noticed something was off about my appearance. So I deflected, said I was just tired, even though what I really meant was that I was tired of being inside my own head. Around 10:30, Olivia started passing her phone around with the group photo, and I braced myself when it got to me, already feeling that familiar dread rise again. I looked at the screen, and for a second I did not even recognize myself because I was expecting to see something distorted, something obviously wrong, but instead I just looked like a normal guy standing slightly off-center, smiling awkwardly but not disastrously, not hideous, not the disaster I had built up in my mind. I actually checked again, zoomed in a little, trying to find the thing I knew had to be there, the flaw that would confirm everything, but it just was not. I handed the phone back slowly, and for the first time that night, something in my head went quiet. It was not some huge revelation all at once, more like a crack forming in something I had treated as solid for years. I started watching the others more closely, not in that paranoid way, but just observing, and I realized nobody was scanning each other the way I scanned myself. Marcus had a stain on his shirt and did not care. Jason's hair was a mess. Ethan's laugh was louder than it needed to be, and none of it mattered because everyone was too busy being themselves to dissect each other. That realization hit harder than anything else because it meant the voice in my head that had been narrating my flaws all these years was not a reflection of reality, it was just me. I felt this strange mix of relief and anger, like I had wasted so much time hiding from something that was never actually happening. That was the moment something shifted, because instead of shrinking further into myself, I decided to test it. I stood up, walked into the middle of the room, and joined whatever conversation Marcus and Jason were having, not perfectly, not confidently, but deliberately. I expected at any second to feel that same wave of scrutiny crash over me, but it did not come. They argued, laughed, included me, and the world did not end because I was not standing at the perfect angle or because my face was not arranged exactly right. Later, Sarah asked me to take another photo with her, just the two of us this time, and my first instinct was still to say no, but I caught it, recognized it as that same old reflex and pushed past it. We took the picture, and I did not immediately ask to see it, did not immediately pick myself apart. I just existed in the moment, which felt unfamiliar but also weirdly lighter. By the time I left around midnight, something fundamental had changed, not in my appearance, but in how much power I was giving to my own perception of it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing it everywhere, how often I assumed people were judging me when they were actually just focused on their own lives, their own insecurities. I began making eye contact more, not as some bold move, but as a quiet experiment, and every time nothing bad happened, that crack in my old belief widened a little more. It did not fix everything overnight. I still had moments where I caught my reflection and felt that old discomfort, but it no longer felt like an absolute truth. It felt like a habit I could question. The biggest change came when Ethan invited me to another gathering a month later, and this time I did not spend an hour outside debating whether to go in. I just went up, knocked, and walked in like I belonged there, not because I suddenly thought I looked perfect, but because I finally understood that nobody else was keeping score the way I had been. The body I could not accept had not actually changed, but the story I was telling myself about it had, and that turned out to matter more than anything I had been trying to fix on the surface. The end of that story feels deeply relieving because the writer learned that Ethan, Sarah, Marcus, Jason, and Olivia were not studying him with the cold attention he had imagined. He was carrying that harsh spotlight inside himself, and once he tested reality, the fear started to lose its hold. That is a powerful lesson because avoidance looks safe for a while, but it keeps a person chained to a false idea of how the world sees him. When someone finally steps forward anyway, even awkwardly, he gives truth a chance to speak. The next story takes that same battle into a different room, where the pressure shows up before a presentation, and the mind starts writing disaster before anything has even happened. So let us walk into that next moment together. The day the script flipped. I was in the bathroom at 8:45 in the morning, gripping the sink like it was the only solid thing left in the world, trying not to pass out before a presentation I had given a dozen times before. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward, breaths coming in sharp, useless bursts, and every thought in my head sounded like a verdict. You are going to blank. You are going to stutter. They are going to see right through you. Marcus is going to regret ever putting you up there. I splashed water on my face and stared at myself like I was a stranger I did not trust. Daniel, get it together, I said out loud, but my voice sounded thin, like it belonged to someone already failing. The worst part was that nothing about the situation had changed. Same slides, same room, same team. But somehow today felt like the day everything would fall apart, like I had finally run out of luck, and everyone would realize I had no idea what I was doing. I checked the time again, even though I already knew it, 8:52, and the countdown in my head got louder. When I walked out, I half expected someone to stop me, to say actually we found someone better. You can sit this one out, but no one did. Sarah was at her desk scrolling through emails. She looked up and smiled like nothing was wrong. Hey, you good for the deck at 9? She asked, and I nodded too quickly, like I was trying to outrun the question. Marcus passed by with his coffee and gave me a thumbs up. No scrutiny, no hidden disappointment, just a normal gesture I somehow twisted into pressure. I kept thinking they must know. They must be able to see the panic like a stain on me. The conference room filled slowly, chairs scraping, laptops opening, casual chatter about weekend plans, and I sat there rehearsing every possible way I could mess up. My mind ran simulations like it was obsessed with disaster. I pictured myself freezing on slide 3, mispronouncing a key term, someone asking a question I could not answer, the room going quiet in that heavy way that means you have failed publicly and completely. By the time Marcus introduced me, my hands were already shaking. I stood up anyway because there was no graceful exit left, and as I walked to the front I had this weird detached thought, this is it, this is where it all gets exposed. I started talking, and for the first minute I barely heard myself. My voice felt distant, like it was coming through a wall, and I was waiting for the interruption, the frown, the signal that I had crossed some invisible line into obvious incompetence. It did not come. Slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, the exact moment I had imagined breaking down, and nothing happened except that I kept speaking. I stumbled once on a word, just slightly, and braced for impact, but Sarah just nodded like she was following along, and Marcus leaned back in his chair like he always did, neutral, relaxed. No one flinched, no one cared. That was the first crack in the script that had been running my life for years. It was so small I almost missed it, but it was there. The catastrophe I had rehearsed did not match reality. I kept going, still tense, but now a second thought pushed in, quieter but persistent. What if this is just in your head? I reached the midpoint of the presentation and something shifted. I realized I had spent more energy preparing for judgment than for the actual content, and yet the content was carrying me just fine. My slides made sense, my points connected. When I asked if anyone had questions, there was a pause, but it was the normal kind, the kind where people are thinking, not the kind where they are silently agreeing that you have failed. Then James asked something practical about implementation, not a gotcha, not a challenge to my competence, just a question that assumed I knew what I was talking about. I answered it, and even as I spoke, I felt this strange mix of confusion and relief. Why was I so sure they would tear me apart? Where did that certainty even come from? The rest of the presentation went by almost calmly, not because I suddenly became confident, but because I started noticing the gap between what I feared and what was actually happening. When it ended, there was a brief round of thanks, a couple of nods, and people started packing up. No dramatic applause, no harsh critique, just a normal meeting ending the way meetings always do. Marcus came up to me and said, "Good job, clear and to the point," and then he moved on to talk to someone else. That was it. No hidden meaning. No disappointment disguised as politeness. Just good job. I sat back down and felt this wave hit me, not panic this time, but something closer to disbelief. I had built this whole internal world where I was constantly on the verge of being exposed, and it just did not line up with reality. Later, around 11:15, I was at my desk replaying the morning, and I realized how automatic the negative script had been. It was not just this presentation. It was every interaction. Walking into a room, sending an email, making a joke, I was always preloading the outcome with "they will think I am useless." It never occurred to me that this was just one possible narrative, not an objective truth. Sarah came by and dropped a file on my desk, then paused and said, "You looked nervous at the start, but you settled in fast." It was solid. The way she said it was so matter-of-fact that it almost annoyed me. Not because she was wrong, but because it highlighted how off my internal meter was. I had felt like I was on the edge of collapse, and externally it just read as a bit nervous at the start. That disconnect bothered me enough that I could not ignore it anymore. Around 1:30, I took a walk outside, trying to make sense of it. Johannesburg was loud and alive around me, cars, voices, the usual chaos, and for once my thoughts were not drowning it out completely. I asked myself a question I had never seriously considered. What if the voice in my head is not a reliable narrator? It sounds obvious now, but at the time it felt like I was breaking some rule. That voice had always been treated as truth, even when it was brutal. If it said you were going to fail, I prepared for failure like it was inevitable. If it said people are judging you, I acted like I was already being judged. But that morning had given me evidence that it could be wrong, not slightly off, but completely off. That realization did not instantly fix anything, but it created space. The next time the thought came, "They will think you are useless," I caught it and added something new. "This is my fear talking, not reality." It felt awkward, almost forced, like I was trying on a line that did not quite fit yet, but it interrupted the old script just enough. Over the next few days, I kept doing it. Every time my mind spun up a worst-case scenario, I labeled it. Fear not fact, prediction not evidence. I still felt the anxiety that did not disappear overnight, but it stopped feeling like a prophecy. It became more like background noise I could choose not to obey. I noticed small changes first. I spoke up a bit earlier in meetings instead of waiting for the perfect moment that never came. I sent emails without rereading them 10 times. I made eye contact more often because I was not assuming I would see judgment there, and nothing catastrophic happened. If anything, people responded more normally, even more positively, like I was finally participating instead of hiding. One evening around 6:05, Marcus asked if I could lead a bigger presentation the following week, one that actually mattered for a client decision. The old script tried to kick in immediately, louder this time because the stakes were higher. "You barely survived the last one. This will expose you." But now there was a second voice, not louder but steadier. "That is your fear talking, not reality. You have evidence now." I hesitated for a moment, feeling both voices pull in opposite directions, and then I said yes. Not because I suddenly believed I would be perfect, but because I no longer believed my fear was a reliable forecast. That was the day the script flipped. Not into blind confidence, not into thinking I could not fail, but into recognizing that most of the pressure I felt was something I was generating and then reacting to as if it came from everyone else. It did not untangle everything in my life overnight, but it changed the direction. Instead of constantly defending against imagined judgment, I started testing reality more often. And reality, more often than not, was a lot less hostile than the version I had been rehearsing in my head for years. Daniel reached an important turning point there, because he stopped obeying every cruel sentence his fear placed in front of him. Marcus and Sarah did not confirm his worst beliefs. Instead, reality showed him that the script in his head was far more hostile than the people around him ever were. That is what makes his next step so strong, because saying yes while still afraid is often the first true boundary a person sets against panic. But fear does not only attack work, school, or public moments. Sometimes it creeps into love itself and convinces a person that kindness cannot be trusted, that warmth must be tested, and that being cared for is somehow dangerous. So let us take a breath and read the next story together. I pushed away everyone who loved me because I was convinced I didn't deserve it. I never thought I would be the kind of person who sabotages their own happiness, but here I am at 23, looking back at the wreckage of relationships I burned down with my own hands. It started small maybe a year ago when my girlfriend Maya would say something nice about me, and I would feel this weird tightness in my chest, like I was being handed something I had not earned. Instead of saying thank you, or just letting it land, I would make a joke to deflect, or find something wrong with what she said like she was lying, or trying to make me feel better out of pity. The first time I remember doing it clearly was when she told me she was proud of how I handled a tough week at work, and I immediately said something about how she did not know the whole story, and how I probably just got lucky. Her face changed just a little, like she had reached out, and I had slapped her hand away. I told myself I was just being humble or keeping things real, but deep down I knew I was testing her to see if she would eventually realize I was not worth all this warmth she kept offering. With my best friend Jordan, it was even worse because he had been there since middle school and loved me in that ride or die way that guys do not say out loud, but show by always answering the phone and showing up no matter what. When he started noticing I was pulling back, he would ask if everything was okay, and I would say yeah, of course, just busy. But then I would ignore his texts for days or cancel plans last minute with some weak excuse. The worst part is I would pick fights with him over stupid things like him being 5 minutes late or using the wrong tone in a text message, and I would act like it was this huge betrayal when really I was just trying to prove that he was not as loyal as I thought, so I would not have to feel so guilty about letting him down later. My mom called me every Sunday like she always had, and I would answer, but keep the conversation short and surface level, because I could not handle the way she would ask how I was really doing with this softness in her voice that made me want to cry. I started believing that if I could just confirm that everyone was going to leave me eventually, then it would not hurt as much when it actually happened, so I would create scenarios where they had the chance to walk away, and I would watch them like a hawk, waiting for the moment they took the bait. Maya would plan these nice evenings for us, and I would find reasons to ruin them by bringing up old arguments or acting distant, until she would get frustrated and ask what was wrong. And I would say nothing when the truth was I was terrified that she was going to see through me and realize I was just this insecure kid pretending to be a grown man. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday night when I had just finished picking a fight with Jordan over something so stupid I cannot even remember what it was about, and I was sitting alone in my apartment, feeling this familiar mix of relief and emptiness, like I had just dodged a bullet, but also shot myself in the foot. My phone buzzed, and it was a voice message from my mom, and I almost did not open it, but something made me press play. And she was just talking about how she remembered when I was 7 and scared of the dark, and how I would come into her room and stand by the bed until she would reach down and pull me up and tell me I was safe. She said she wished I knew how much I was loved back then, and how she hoped I could feel it now, even when I make it hard for people to show it. I sat there listening to her voice break a little at the end, and I realized that every single time I pushed someone away, I was not protecting myself from being hurt, I was protecting myself from being loved, and that love was the only thing that could actually fix whatever was broken inside me. It was like someone had turned on a light in a room I had been sitting in for years convincing myself. It was pitch black, and I could finally see that the walls I had built were not keeping danger out, they were keeping help out. The next morning I called Jordan, and I did not make excuses or act like nothing happened. I just told him I was sorry, and that I had been dealing with some stuff, and I was pushing people away because I was scared, and he was quiet for a second. And then he said he knew something was up, and he was not going anywhere, and we talked for like 2 hours about everything I had been too ashamed to say out loud. With Maya it was harder because I had hurt her so many times that she had started to believe my version of the story, that maybe I just did not care about her as much as she cared about me. But I showed up at her door, and I told her the truth about how I was convinced I was unworthy, and how I kept testing her to see if she would leave, because I thought it would be easier than facing the fact that I was the one who did not know how to stay. She cried and I cried, and it was messy and uncomfortable, but it was real in a way that nothing between us had been for months. I am not saying I fixed everything overnight, because old habits do not just disappear, but now when I feel that tightness in my chest, when someone says something kind, I try to just sit with it and let it be true instead of looking for the trap. I still catch myself wanting to pull back when things get too close, but I have learned to tell the people I love what is happening instead of acting it out, and that has made all the difference. The irony is that all this time I thought I was protecting myself from being abandoned, but I was the one doing the abandoning, and the people who loved me were just waiting for me to let them in, so they could help me carry the weight I was so determined to carry alone. That last ending was heartbreaking and healing at the same time, because the writer finally stopped mistaking love for a trap. Maya, Jordan, and his mother were not trying to expose him or corner him. They were trying to stay near him while he kept testing whether he deserved to be left behind. Once he saw that he had been protecting himself from being loved, not from being harmed, the walls began to lose their purpose. That lesson matters because fear can make isolation look noble when it is really just painful surrender. The next story carries that same fight into everyday life, where a man gets tired of hiding and decides he will not let fear make every choice for him anymore. So let us step into that next story together. The day I decided to stop being a coward. I spent most of my teenage years convinced that everyone was secretly keeping a list of every stupid thing I ever said. I would walk into a room and immediately start scanning faces, looking for signs of disgust or boredom, or that subtle little smirk that meant someone was thinking about how pathetic I was. It was exhausting. I stopped going to parties. I stopped answering texts. I stopped making eye contact with the cashier at the grocery store, because what if I said something awkward, and she remembered me forever as that weird kid who couldn't order a sandwich without turning it into a whole situation. The worst part was that I knew it was all in my head. I knew nobody was actually keeping score. But knowing that didn't make the feeling go away. It just made me feel even more broken, like I had this defect in my brain that prevented me from functioning like a normal human being. I started pushing people away before they could get close enough to see the real messed up version of me. My best friend Marcus called me out on it one day after I cancelled plans for the 3rd time in a row. He said, "You are acting like you are already guilty of something, and you are waiting for everyone else to figure it out." That hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I spent the next few weeks thinking about what he said. I realized that I was living my entire life from a place of fear. I was so terrified of being judged that I was judging myself way harder than anyone else ever could. I was the one keeping myself in this tiny little box, and then acting surprised when I felt suffocated. So I made a decision. I decided that I was going to start acting as if I was worthy of love and connection and belonging, even though I did not believe it yet. I figured that if I kept waiting until I felt confident before I did anything, I would be waiting forever. So I started small. I answered a text within an hour instead of waiting 3 days to seem cool. I made eye contact with the barista at the coffee shop and said thank you like I actually meant it. I showed up to things even when I wanted to bail. At first it felt like wearing someone else's clothes. Everything felt wrong and fake and like I was pretending to be a person I was not. But then something weird started happening. People responded differently. They smiled more. They asked me questions. They actually seemed happy to see me. I remember going to this small get-together at my friend Sarah's apartment. Normally, I would have spent the whole night standing in the corner, arms crossed, waiting for someone to point out how out of place I was. But this time I walked in and I actually introduced myself to people. I asked them questions. I laughed at jokes even when I was not sure if they were funny. And the craziest thing happened. Nobody looked at me like I was some kind of alien. They just talked to me like I was a regular person. It was like I had been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. The old story I had been telling myself about how I was fundamentally broken and unlovable started to feel less and less true. Not because I suddenly became a different person, but because I finally stopped acting like I was on trial. I started noticing that most people were too caught up in their own insecurities to spend much time judging me. They were worried about their own lists of stupid things they had said. They were not keeping score of mine. This realization did not fix everything overnight. I still have days where the old anxiety creeps in. I still catch myself wanting to isolate when things get hard, but now I have evidence. I have actual proof that the world is not out to get me. I have memories of people being kind to me when I gave them the chance. I have relationships that are deeper now because I stopped pushing people away before they could get close. The fear has not disappeared completely, but it has lost its power. I still feel it sometimes, that old urge to retreat back into my shell, but now I know that it is just a feeling, not a fact. It is just my brain trying to protect me from a threat that does not actually exist. And when I recognize that, I can choose differently. I can choose to trust that I am worthy even when I am scared. I can choose to show up even when I want to hide. I can choose connection over isolation, even when it feels uncomfortable. It is not always easy. Some days it feels like I am swimming upstream against years of conditioned thinking. But I have learned that the only way out is through. The only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to keep showing up until you realize you were never impostoring in the first place. You were just a person all along, worthy of love and belonging, too scared to believe it. I think about Marcus sometimes and how he called me out that day. I never properly thanked him for it. He saw something in me that I could not see in myself. He saw that I was capable of more than I was giving myself credit for. I hope that if someone reading this is stuck in the same place I was, they can find their own version of that moment. The moment where you realize that you are the one keeping yourself prisoner. The moment where you decide that you are done letting fear make your decisions for you. It is scary to let go of the old story. It feels safer to stay small and predictable. But nothing good ever grew in the dark. Nothing meaningful ever came from playing it safe. The magic happens when you choose to trust yourself even when you are terrified. When you choose to believe that you are worthy even before you have all the proof. Because here is the thing, the proof will come, but only if you are brave enough to go looking for it. The writer in that story earned his peace the hard way because he kept showing up before confidence arrived. Marcus did him a real kindness by naming the fear for what it was, and the writer answered that challenge with brave little choices that slowly opened his life back up. That is how self-respect often begins, not with one perfect breakthrough, but with steady proof that the old fear is not telling the truth. Sometimes, though, a person still needs someone who knows him well to speak even more directly and point out the pattern he can no longer see clearly on his own. That next story brings us to exactly that kind of moment, and it is one worth listening to closely. So let us read the next story together. My best friend called me out for treating myself like I was the enemy. I was 23 and I had turned suspicion into a survival skill. It started in middle school when a group of kids decided I was the punchline of their week-long joke, and it never really stopped. By the time I hit high school, I was scanning every room for exit routes and every face for signs of contempt. I thought it was just being realistic. I thought everyone walked around like that, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Turns out most people were just living their lives. I was the only one conducting a full security audit on every conversation I was part of. My closest friend Marcus noticed before I did. We had been friends since freshman year when we got paired for a stupid chemistry project and ended up spending 3 hours arguing about the best PlayStation game instead of actually doing the work. We stayed close through college. He was the one who drove out to pick me up when my first serious relationship imploded and I refused to answer my phone for 2 days. He was the one who showed up with a box of pizza when I got rejected from every grad school I applied to. He never asked a lot of questions. He just showed up. That was Marcus. The night everything shifted was a Tuesday. I remember because I had spent the entire day replaying a conversation I had with a coworker named David. He had made an offhand comment about how my presentation could use more data in the second section, and I had turned it into proof that everyone thought I was incompetent. I sent Marcus a long text about it around 8 that night, and he told me to come over. He lived 20 minutes away and I drove there in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I got to his apartment, he was already on the couch with 2 beers open. He handed me one and I sat down and immediately started talking about David and how he probably hated me, and how I should just quit before they fired me for being useless. I talked for maybe 10 minutes straight. Marcus listened the whole time without interrupting, and when I finally stopped to take a breath, he put his beer down on the coffee table and looked at me. He did not yell. He did not get dramatic. He just spoke in this calm, steady voice that cut right through all the noise in my head. He said, "You treat yourself worse than anyone else ever has." He said I needed to hear that. He said I had turned suspicion into a reflex and self-sabotage into a habit. He said I convinced myself that everyone was out to get me, so I would never have to face the possibility that I was just scared. He said I pushed people away before they could get close enough to disappoint me. He said I rehearsed every conversation in my head for hours because I was terrified of saying the wrong thing, even though no one else was keeping score. He said I was the only one holding myself to a standard that would break anyone else. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he did not get it. I wanted to list every time someone had actually let me down or every moment I had been genuinely humiliated. But the words would not come because he was right. I had spent years building this fortress inside my own head and then acting like the world was the one trying to break in. I had convinced myself that my insecurity was just objective truth. I told myself I was being realistic about how people saw me, when really I was projecting every fear I had ever felt onto every person who tried to get close. Marcus kept going. He said I had this pattern where I would get close to someone and then find a reason to pull back. He said I would start picking fights with my girlfriends over things that did not matter just so I could prove they would leave eventually. He said I would avoid applying for opportunities because I was sure I would fail anyway. He said I had turned my own anxiety into a self-fulfilling prophecy and then acted like it was just the way things were. He said I needed to stop pretending my insecurity was facts when it was really just fear wearing a mask. I sat there and I felt something crack open in my chest, not in a painful way, in the way a door opens after you have been pushing against it for years without realizing it was never locked. I looked at Marcus and I asked him how long he had seen this going on. He said since high school. He said he watched me turn down a scholarship because I was sure they only picked me by mistake. He said he watched me end a friendship with a girl named Sarah because I was convinced she was only nice to me out of pity. He said he watched me spend entire weekends alone in my room because I was too scared to go out and risk being judged. I do not remember much else from that night. I remember we finished our beers and sat in silence for a while. I remember Marcus told me I did not have to fix everything that night. I remember he told me the first step was just noticing the pattern. I remember driving home and pulling into my driveway and just sitting there for 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. I remember feeling exhausted in a way I had never felt before. Not physically tired, emotionally drained from years of carrying around this weight I did not need to carry. The next few weeks were strange. I started catching myself in the act. I would be in a meeting and I would feel that familiar spike of anxiety when someone asked me a question, and I would hear Marcus's voice in my head saying, "You are the only one keeping score." I would be on a date and I would feel the urge to pick a fight over something small, and I would stop and ask myself if I was trying to prove I was right or if I was trying to protect myself from getting hurt. I started noticing how much energy I spent on things that never actually happened. I started noticing how many people I had pushed away because I was sure they would leave eventually. It did not fix everything overnight. I still have days where the old patterns creep back in. I still catch myself rehearsing conversations in my head or assuming the worst about what someone meant, but the difference is I know now that it comes from me. I know that my insecurity is not the world being cruel. It is me being scared, and knowing that changes everything. It means I can challenge it. It means I can choose to trust even when my brain tells me not to. It means I can let people in without waiting for them to prove they will not hurt me. Marcus and I still talk about it sometimes. Not in a heavy way, just in the way you talk about something that changed you. He never acts like he saved me. He just says he saw me digging a hole and he told me to stop. I tell him it was the best thing anyone ever did for me. He tells me I did the hard part. I tell him he was the one who saw through it when I could not. We both know the truth. It was both of us, it had to be. I wish I could go back and tell the kid I was in high school that he did not have to live like that. That he did not have to walk around like he was waiting for an attack that was never coming. That he did not have to turn every friendship into a test and every relationship into a countdown. I wish I could tell him that the voice in his head was not the truth. It was just fear, and fear can be quieted, it can be challenged, it can be untangled, I wish I could tell him that the moment he realized his insecurity was self-generated was the moment he got his life back. I cannot go back, but I can tell you this. If you are reading this and you feel like you are constantly bracing for impact, stop and ask yourself who is actually throwing the punches. Chances are it is just you, and you can put your hands down. No one is keeping score. No one is waiting for you to fail. The only person treating you like you are not enough is you, and you can stop that whenever you are ready. That story lands with real force because Marcus did not flatter the writer or soften the truth until it meant nothing. He stood up for him by showing him that the harshest enemy in his life had become the way he treated himself, and once the writer faced that, he could finally begin putting down a weight he was never meant to carry. There is something deeply powerful about realizing your insecurity has been wearing the mask of facts for years. But even after that kind of wake-up call, another layer still remains, the constant inner voice that edits every move and pretends to speak for the whole world. The next story steps right into that illusion and pulls it apart piece by piece. So let us move into the next story together. The inner critic's illusion. I spent most of my teenage years convinced I was living in front of a live audience that never left the theater. Every awkward pause, every half-formed sentence in class, every time I tripped over my own feet in the hallway, I felt the invisible crowd leaning in, whispering, ranking, and scoring me on a scale I never asked to be graded on. I thought everyone else had gotten a secret instruction manual for how to exist without constantly fearing they were about to be exposed as a fraud. I did not know yet that the audience I was so terrified of was almost entirely a projection of my own insecurity, and that the harshest voice in the room was not outside my head at all, but inside it, running a relentless commentary track that I had mistaken for truth. It started with small things. I would walk into school and immediately scan faces for any sign of judgment. If someone glanced at me and then looked away quickly, I convinced myself they had just noticed something wrong with me. If a teacher asked a question and I hesitated before answering, I was sure the whole class thought I was stupid. I began to edit myself in real time, filtering every word, every gesture, every laugh, trying to preemptively fix flaws that no one else had even seen. My inner narrator was brutal. It had a tone that sounded oddly like a disappointed adult who had decided I was not going to amount to much. You are so awkward, they can tell you are nervous. You are going to say something dumb, just shut up. That voice was always on, and I believed it was telling me the truth about how the world saw me. Relationships suffered because I could not relax around people. With friends, I overanalyzed every text. If someone took too long to reply, I assumed I had annoyed them or said something cringe earlier. On dates, I was so focused on monitoring my own behavior that I barely listened to the other person. I worried about how I sounded, how I looked, whether my jokes landed, whether I was coming across as too eager or not interested enough. I was not really present. I was too busy performing for an audience that existed only in my head. The irony was that by trying so hard to avoid being judged, I made myself stiff, distant, and insecure, which probably made me harder to connect with in the first place. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon when I was sitting in the back of a classroom, waiting for a presentation to start. My heart was already racing. I was next up and my usual script was playing on loop. You are going to freeze. Everyone will notice your hands shaking. They will remember this forever. Then, almost by accident, I looked around the room. Some people were scrolling on their phones. Two friends were whispering about something that had nothing to do with school. One guy was asleep with his head on his desk. Nobody was scrutinizing me. Nobody was waiting for me to fail. In that moment, it hit me like a physical blow. The audience I had been performing for my entire life was not real. The judgment I feared was not coming from them. It was coming from me. That realization did not fix everything overnight, but it changed the angle I viewed my thoughts from. I started to notice how often my inner critic spoke in absolutes. They all think you are weird. You always mess this up. No one likes you. I began to ask myself simple questions when those thoughts showed up. Who exactly is all? What evidence do I have that they think this? When I looked for actual proof, it usually vanished. Most people were wrapped up in their own lives, their own insecurities, their own mental commentary tracks. The idea that I was the main character in everyone else's story was a fantasy my anxiety had sold me. I tested this by deliberately doing small, mildly uncomfortable things in public. I wore an outfit I liked but was slightly nervous about. I asked a question in class even when I was not sure it was smart. I laughed loudly at something funny instead of stifling it. Nothing catastrophic happened. No one mocked me. The world did not end. More importantly, I noticed that the voice in my head got quieter over time. It still showed up, but instead of treating it like a news anchor delivering facts, I started to see it for what it was. A scared part of me trying to protect me from rejection by keeping me small. It was not an objective judge. It was a scared kid with a megaphone. This shift untangled a lot. Anxiety lost some of its grip because I was no longer feeding it with the belief that everyone was watching. Fear of judgment softened when I realized most people were too busy judging themselves to spend much time on me. Strained relationships improved because I could actually listen instead of monitoring my own performance. Low self-esteem did not disappear, but it stopped defining me. I began to treat myself with more kindness, not because I had suddenly become perfect, but because I understood that the harshness I had been living under was not truth. It was a story I had been telling myself, and I could choose to tell a different one. I still have moments where the old voice tries to take over. Before big social events, before important conversations, before anything that feels like it could expose me, I feel that familiar tightening in my chest. But now I know what it is. It is not the voice of the world. It is not the voice of reality. It is the echo of my own insecurity, amplified by years of believing it was the only honest thing in the room. When it speaks, I do not have to obey it. I can notice it, thank it for trying to protect me, and then do what matters anyway. The audience was never real. The only one who was always watching, judging, and scoring me was me. And once I saw that, I was finally free to step off the stage and just live. The ending there feels quietly freeing, because the writer stopped bowing to that inner critic as if it were some all-knowing judge. He saw that most people were busy carrying their own worries, while the loudest cruelty in his life had been coming from a scared voice inside his own head. Once he understood that, he could stop shrinking himself to please an audience that was never really there. That is a huge shift, but fear has a stubborn way of returning in new language, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as prediction, sometimes as a story repeated so often it starts to feel permanent. The next writer reaches that exact realization and begins rewriting the script he had been living by for years. So let us read the next story together. I realized my anxiety was just a story I kept rewriting. I was 17 when I finally understood that the voice in my head telling me everyone hated me was not reality, but a habit I had trained myself to believe. It started small in middle school when I walked into the cafeteria and felt like every eye was tracking my awkward shuffle to the table. I remember standing there with my tray of soggy pizza and thinking that the girl in the blue hoodie was definitely laughing at the way I held my fork. I did not know her name then, but I called her Emily in my head, and I decided she was the judge of my entire social worth. By the time I reached high school, I had built an entire internal surveillance system that scanned every conversation for hidden insults and every silence for proof that I was boring or unwanted. My best friend Marcus would say, "Dude, you are overthinking it," and I would nod, but inside I was already 3 steps ahead, imagining how he was probably tired of my company and just waiting for an excuse to drift away. This pattern followed me into every relationship I ever had. I dated a girl named Chloe for 6 months in junior year, and I spent half that time convinced she was staying with me out of pity. I would analyze the way she texted back, and if she took more than an hour to reply, I would spiral into a story where she was discussing my flaws with her friends and planning her exit. The worst part was that I never questioned these thoughts. I treated them like facts written in stone, instead of what they actually were, which was fear dressed up as intuition. Things changed during the summer after graduation, when I took a job at a movie theater to save money for college. I was assigned to work the concession stand with a coworker named Tyler, who had this annoying habit of humming while he scooped popcorn. At first I thought he was doing it to irritate me, because surely he could tell I was stressed about getting the orders right. I spent 3 shifts building a whole narrative about how Tyler thought I was incompetent and was trying to undermine me by being casually dismissive. Then one afternoon during a slow lull, he turned to me and said, "You seem really tense, man, is everything okay?" And I just froze, because it did not fit the story I had written. I told him I was fine, but he kept talking about how he used to get panic attacks before his shifts, and how he learned to just ask himself if what he was worried about was actually happening, or just something his brain was making up. That question hit me like a punch to the chest. Is this happening, or is my brain making it up? I started testing it out on small things first. When I walked into a room and felt like people were staring, I would look around and actually count how many heads were turned. Spoiler alert, it was almost never anyone. When Chloe took hours to text back, I would remind myself that she had a life and a job and a family, and that her silence was not a verdict on my value. It was exhausting at first because my brain fought back hard. It wanted to keep me safe by predicting every possible rejection before it could happen. But slowly, I began to see the pattern for what it was, which was a reflex, not a truth. I started calling out my own thoughts like an annoying roommate who would not shut up. Oh, there is that story again, where Marcus is secretly mad at me, even though he literally invited me to his birthday party. Or look at this classic, where I am convinced the teacher thinks I am stupid because I asked one question. The more I questioned the narrative, the less power it had over me. I still felt anxiety, of course, but it no longer controlled my decisions. I stopped avoiding social events because I assumed everyone would be judging me. I started speaking up in class even when my voice shook, because I realized that the worst-case scenario of people thinking I was dumb was something I had been living with anyway, and it had not actually ruined my life. The biggest shift came in my relationship with my parents. I had spent years assuming they were disappointed in me for not being more outgoing or more successful, or more anything really. I would come home from school and brace myself for the conversation where they would ask about my day, and I would have to defend my choices. But one night my dad asked me how work was, and instead of giving him the short defensive answer I usually gave, I told him about Tyler and the popcorn and the question that had changed everything. He listened, and then he said, "I had no idea you felt that way. We are just proud you are trying hard," and I felt something inside me crack open. It was the realization that I had been filtering their love through the same lens of doubt I used on everyone else. I had been so busy expecting rejection that I could not see the acceptance that was already there. I am not saying I am cured. I still catch myself falling into old patterns when I am stressed or tired. But now I have a tool that I can use to pull myself back. I ask myself if what I am afraid of is actually happening, or if it is just a story I am telling myself. And more often than not, it is just a story. A story I wrote when I was young and scared and did not know any better. A story I do not have to keep reading anymore. That ninth story ended with a real turning point, because the writer finally saw that Chloe, Marcus, Tyler, and even his parents were not living inside the cruel version of events his anxiety kept inventing. He was brave enough to question the story instead of obeying it, and that simple question began to break years of fear apart. That is the kind of change that matters, because it turns anxiety from a master into something that can be challenged. But one more wound still waits at the edge of this collection, and it is a painful one. It is the kind of fear that teaches a person to stay silent until that silence starts hurting more than speaking ever could. So let us take one final breath and read the next story together. The silence that screamed. I spent 3 years of high school convinced my voice was a curse. Not because I was quiet by nature, but because every time I opened my mouth in my head, I heard an echo of rejection before I even spoke. I'd sit in class with my hand half raised, heart hammering, watching someone else answer the question I'd been mentally rehearsing for 10 minutes. With friends, I'd nod along to conversations, swallowing jokes or opinions, because I was sure they'd think I was stupid, boring, or weird if I actually said them out loud. The worst part wasn't the silence itself. It was the story I told myself about why I stayed silent. I believed my thoughts were fundamentally worthless. That if people really heard what was in my head, they'd realize I was a fraud and pull away. So I became a ghost in my own life, present but invisible, terrified that speaking would shatter the fragile illusion that I belonged. I remember one afternoon in junior year, sitting with a group of guys at lunch. They were talking about some video game release, and I knew a ton about it because I'd been reading forums for weeks. My mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I had this perfect, detailed take ready to go, something that would have added to the conversation. But instead, I just smiled and nodded, while Marcus dominated the whole discussion with surface-level stuff he'd clearly just heard from someone else. I went home that day angry, but not at him. At myself, because I'd let my own fear write me out of the moment. The strain started showing up everywhere. My grades slipped because I wouldn't ask questions in class, even when I was completely lost. Teachers thought I wasn't paying attention, when really I was just paralyzed by the thought of sounding dumb in front of 30 people. Friends started drifting a bit too, not because they didn't like me, but because I was so hard to read. I'd give short answers, deflect questions, never volunteer anything real about myself. They probably thought I didn't trust them. Truth was, I didn't trust myself to be interesting enough to deserve their attention. One night, I was up late doom-scrolling, and I stumbled on this old post from someone describing almost exactly what I was going through. They called it the silence that screamed, which hit me so hard I had to put my phone down. The post talked about how the loudest noise in their life wasn't anything external, but the constant internal roar of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios every time they considered speaking up. That's when something shifted. I realized I'd been treating my silence like protection, when really it was the thing hurting me most. The next day, I made myself do one small thing. In history class, Mr. Davies asked if anyone had thoughts on the Cold War reading. My hand shot up before I could stop it. My voice cracked when I started talking, and I could feel my face burning, but I pushed through. I said maybe 3 sentences, nothing groundbreaking. But when I finished, Mr. Davies nodded and said, "Good point. Anyone else want to build on that?" And then someone did. They actually built on what I'd said. No one laughed. No one looked at me like I was wasting their time. The world didn't end. That tiny moment cracked something open. I started testing it little by little. I'd throw out a comment in a group chat. I'd ask a question in class even if I was 80% sure I already knew the answer. And every single time, the rejection I'd been bracing for never came. People responded normally. Sometimes they even seemed glad I'd spoken. It was like I'd been standing outside a party for years, convinced I wasn't welcome, when really the door was unlocked the whole time and I just never tried the handle. The real gut punch came a few months later. I was talking with my friend Tyler after school, and somehow the conversation turned to how we perceived each other back in freshman year. I mentioned I'd always felt like I had nothing valuable to contribute to our group. Tyler looked at me, genuinely confused, and said, "Jude, we always wondered why you were so quiet. Half the time I thought you didn't even like us." That hit me like a truck. All that time, I wasn't protecting myself from rejection. I was creating distance that didn't need to exist. People weren't waiting to judge me, they were waiting to know me. My silence wasn't keeping me safe, it was keeping me alone. Once I saw that, the anxiety started losing its grip. Not overnight, but steadily. I still get nervous before speaking up sometimes, especially in bigger groups or with people I don't know well, but the story I tell myself now is different. Instead of "they'll think I'm dumb," it's "they might actually want to hear this." And more often than not, they do. Relationships got easier too. I stopped overthinking every text, every pause in conversation. I started sharing actual thoughts instead of just mirroring what others said. Turns out people like you more when you give them something real to connect with. My self-esteem didn't magically fix itself, but it stopped bleeding. I wasn't constantly reinforcing the idea that I was worthless. I was proving to myself over and over that I had something to offer. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't learning to speak. It was realizing the barrier was mine alone. No one else had put it there. No one else was holding it up. I built that wall out of fear, brick by brick, and then spent years terrified of what was on the other side. When I finally climbed down, I found out the other side was just people. Regular people waiting to talk to me, laugh with me, know me. The silence that screamed was never about them. It was always about me. And once I understood that, it lost its power. There is a quiet truth running through all of these stories, and it is this. A person can live for years under pressure that feels completely real, only to find that the harshest judge in his life has been the voice inside his own head. These writers were not weak. They were tired. They were carrying fear, shame, doubt, and old pain for so long that it started to sound like truth. But again and again, the same healing moment arrived. Someone kind spoke plainly. A full story cracked open. A small brave choice was made. And little by little, each writer began to come back to himself. That matters because peace usually does not arrive all at once. It comes when a man stops calling fear wisdom. It comes when he lets love in, speaks before the perfect words arrive, and tests reality instead of surrendering to his worst assumptions. If you are listening tonight and some part of this feels close to home, hold on to this gently. You do not have to believe every cruel thought that reaches you. You do not have to keep serving a version of yourself built entirely from worry. You are allowed to be imperfect, visible, honest, and still deeply worthy of care. Let your breathing slow now. Let the pressure ease. Let the noise in your mind soften and drift a little farther away. Rest in the thought that not every fear is a warning, not every silence is safety, and not every story in your head deserves to lead your life. Take care of yourselves, establish those boundaries early, and sweet dreams, everyone.